Hello, and a very warm welcome to the Journey Journals by Life of Gaia. My name is Gaia, and today I'm delighted to have back with us again author Merle R. Saferstein. Now, Merle has inspired countless individuals to embrace the power of journaling and leaving a lasting legacy, and we have done another fascinating interview with her around the topic and really delve into a remarkable chapter of Merle's life that spans over 2 decades. Now, Merle was the Director of Educational Outreach at the Holocaust Documentation and Education Center, and she had the unique responsibility and privilege of helping survivors pass along their legacy. And today, I'm delighted to have her join us. A very warm welcome to you, Merle.
Thank you, Gaia. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here again.
So for those viewers who haven't seen your previous interview, would you mind explaining a little bit about your background and what led you to initially start working at the Holocaust Documentation and Education Center? And I know it's a lot of questions, but also a little bit about what the organization was about and your role within it.
I'd be happy to. So my career is basically one of education. So I began teaching third grade, and then I taught first grade. And I did that for about 4.5 years. And then when I had children, I started teaching preschool when my son turned 3 years old. And that led to me directing a preschool for a few years and also directing a day camp with 350 kids and a staff of 75. After that, I left that job and I started working at a private high school. And there were a lot of issues with the administration, so I quit. And from, I'd say, January of '83, for a few years, I was really going through an existential crisis, trying to figure out what I was going to do, who I am, what it's all about. And at the same time, I spent a lot of time at the beach. I had been journaling. Each morning I would walk along the shore, not walk, actually, I would jog along the shore and then walk along the shore. And there was a man who was doing the same thing I was doing. He was jogging. We would wave to each other. After our runs, we would both kind of end up not far away from each other. And I had my journals and my books that I was reading, and he had the same thing. And after probably 2 weeks or so, Tom, his name was Tom Osborne, Tom stopped at my chair and we began talking. Tom had just left the priesthood. He had been in the priesthood for 8 years, and he was trying to figure out what he was going to do with his life. The only difference was that Tom had studied Carl Jung, and he was much more into a spiritual world, something that I was really looking for. I was searching for that. And so he basically shook my hand and said, you can enter this path, but just know that once you do, there's no turning back. And so that was a period of real individuation where I really began to understand who I was. At the same time, for Tom, he was pretty much a lost soul, and I had the stability that I could offer him. So it worked really well. Tom was only here for a few more weeks after that, and then he moved to Washington, D.C., and he was working for the National Council of Churches. And then he left that and went to New York, and he was doing temp work. One of his jobs was to do PR for this operetta that was on off-Broadway called Yours, Anne, which was about the Diary of Anne Frank. At the same time, the producer of the play was the president of the Anne Frank Center in New York City. Someone had found the Anne Frank family photo album in a chest of drawers in Germany, and they sent it to the Amsterdam Anne Frank Center. That center formed an exhibition, a photographic exhibition of 800 photographs using Anne Frank's family photos in the center and surrounding it with the Holocaust. The exhibition was called Anne Frank in the World, 1929 to 1945. This man hired Tom as the director of the Anne Frank Center, and Tom's job was to send the exhibit around the country. And so Tom called me, and Tom and I had been writing and keeping in close touch. He called me up one day and he said, look, I have the opportunity to do this. I'm asking if you would like to be the pilot city. You want to bring it to Miami. You can make it as big as you want. You can do whatever you want. It's a volunteer position. And by then it was almost 2.5 years that I hadn't worked, and I really needed a job. However, my husband was very generous and said to me, you have to do this. Anne Frank speaks to your soul. You're a journal writer. How can you not? So I began and was able to secure the main library in downtown Miami. It had just opened and they were thrilled. The director said, we house Anne Frank on our shelves and this is the place it should be. I had a goal of having 50,000 people see this exhibit in 6 weeks and also to get an editorial in the Miami Herald. And I got the editorial and we saw well over 60,000 people. So during that time, I spoke to a lot of the different organizations, groups, and also probably spoke to about 100 groups of students and did some student programming. And one of the programs that I did, there were 50 high schools in Miami at the time. I had 2 students from each of the schools come to this program. I had the cast and crew from North Miami Beach who had just put on the play, The Diary of Anne Frank. And I had, prior to them putting on the play, had brought a Holocaust survivor to meet with them, someone who had been in hiding just down the street from Anne Frank. And what they did was they actually asked, his name was Jerry Goldsmith, he was a psychologist. They asked him questions as though it was actually from their characters. So for example, Otto Frank would say, so we're having a lot of trouble. There are people fighting. What went on in your home, when you were in hiding? It was a really incredible experience. So none of the students knew anyone else except the kids that they came with. And they only had first names. So nobody knew what schools anyone was from. And here were 25 kids from North Miami Beach and then 2 from all the other high schools. I had 2 women from the Holocaust Center in Miami come. The Holocaust Center is an educational resource center. They were founded in 1980. The founding president was Sister Trinita Flood, who was then the president of Berry University in Miami. And their goal was twofold. One was to take testimony of Holocaust survivors. So they started very early on. And their second was to do educational programming. At the time, they were doing adult programming, but not student programming. So these 2 women came and they saw what was happening. And at the program, I did some journaling with them. We talked about the Holocaust. We explained a little about what the center in our community was doing. And then at one point, right before we went down to lunch, Peter from the play stood up and he gave a line or 2. And then the rest of the cast did an act of the play right there, just in the middle of this big room. And it was really mind-boggling. And then we went down to the exhibit. So fast forward, after the exhibition was over, I got a call from the director saying, we would love you to come and help us. We would love you to come and help us just do some kind of student programming as a volunteer. And so I went, of course, still knowing that I needed to get a job. I began to volunteer. 2 weeks later or 2 months later, I'm not really sure, the secretary quit. And they called me up and said, would you be willing to be the secretary? And I said, I will be the secretary for 3 months, but if I'm not in education, then I need to really be out of there. So it happened that they had hired someone with her PhD who was yet to come to head the department, but she had been hired before I came. And when she arrived, she was a disaster. Unfortunately, the woman was a terrible administrator. So my boss was giving me all the administrative work. And at some point, they fired her. By then, the president of the center was the president of Nova Southeastern University. And he took me to breakfast and he grilled me for about 3 hours. When we were through, he said, you can do this job. And then I was hired as the director of educational outreach. My job was to help the survivors, as you said, pass along their legacy. And we did that in different ways. We had an annual writing and visual arts contest that reached hundreds of students every year. We sent out survivors to speak to an average of 18,000 people a year, heard the survivors speak. We also did a teacher institute. So every June, for 1 week, we had teachers from grades K through college who actually sat with survivors. We had five different survivors, or as many as we needed, actually. But each day, the teachers got to sit with a different survivor for 5 days. And so they really had learned firsthand, which is the best way to learn history. And then the other program that we did was what we called Student Awareness Days. And those were programs where we had anywhere from 250 to 850 students who sat at tables of 10 with a Holocaust survivor, and they had the opportunity to speak to the survivors, ask them questions, learn from them. We also showed a video that was in black and white of pre-war, during the war, post-war, with the sound being letters written by children, letters and diaries, during the Holocaust. So it was a very powerful thing. And then in the afternoon, we would switch the focus and we'd say to the students, these survivors were teenagers just like you. And for them, you know, the kids looked at these people, they were little old ladies and men, but it kind of switched their focus and they began to see it very differently. And we said they had the same hopes and dreams as you had, but prejudice came, you know, people became prejudiced and took away all of that for them. And so living in Miami, we're in a very multicultural community. And we would say to the kids, so what kinds of prejudice are you experiencing? And the whole afternoon would be shifted to the conversation about that, with the survivors really helping these students understand. And so every year we did anywhere from 10 to 12 of those programs in high schools and colleges and universities. And so over the 26 years that I was there, and the last year that I was there, we wrote a grant, and we had to figure out how many students we had touched in the 26 years since we started student programming. And we were just short of 1 million students when we added it up. And that's when I knew it was time to leave.
That's incredible, Merle. And they sound like very, very powerful programs and events. I wanted to ask you, you know, creating educational programs for Holocaust survivors to, you know, transmit their stories is, I feel it's a huge responsibility, and there's a huge sort of emotional component and weight attached to it. And I wanted to ask you, how were you able to, or what did you do to curate these events that kind of help maintain sort of empathy and sympathy on, or not sympathy, empathy and sensitivity on one side, but sort of still remain true to the narrative?
Survivors are so, were and have always been so, not all survivors, I should say, not all survivors, but the survivors we worked with, for them, the most important thing was to pass along their messages. And so we didn't really have to show any sensitivity or empathy necessarily, because they were gung-ho, they wanted to do it. I think the hardest thing was to contain the stories, you know, to sit and listen to these stories. And I always felt so tremendously blessed that I have the gift to be able to be a container for those stories, to certainly feel for them and what they went through, but to be able to go on with my life. There are people who could not hear the stories. And so I just considered it a real blessing that I could. And, you know, it was interesting. On any given day, a survivor would come to me at one of the programs and say to me, today's my birthday. And I would say, it's amazing that you're here. And they would say, there's no place I would rather be than right here. This is my mission. I need to pass along these stories. I need students to learn so this doesn't happen again. But I will say one other thing. There are times at those tables where there were kids who were crying because of the stories, and they would have to leave the table. Interestingly enough, I could go to almost any survivor and say, would you go out in the hall and speak to so-and-so? So one would think that it would be the children comforting the survivors, but it was always the survivors who had the strength and courage and were able to talk to the students.
What an interesting dynamic. And, you know, I feel the ability to hold space and create a container for having these events and for, you know, being in these situations is such a valuable skill. And I think that trust plays a huge part in it too. And I know you mentioned that most of them were gung-ho about telling their stories, but I wanted to ask, what did you do to create sort of a situation of trust where, you know, people felt comfortable opening up to you and opening up to the students?
Gaia, I don't really know that I can answer that question. I mean, I think that I, for me personally, I was just always so open to listening to them. And, when someone has a story and can be heard, it makes such a difference. And so all I can say is that just in my relationships and the way that I related to them, perhaps they just felt that they knew that they were safe. They also really understood our purpose. They knew that what we were doing was for the right reasons, and they trusted us just because of what we were doing. I will say that when I would send survivors out to schools and whatever, I would talk to the teachers and give them some kind of instruction and understanding of what was proper and what wasn't. But I'll never forget the day that a radio station had called and asked for 2 survivors to come to a talk show. And so I sent 2 of our survivors, and in the afternoon, they were going to speak. And suddenly they showed up at my office, and I had no idea why they came to me after they're speaking, because that's not usually what they would do. And they were furious. And why were they furious? Because the radio host did not let me know that he was doing this, but he brought 2 skinheads to debate with the survivors. And it was so horrible. I was so sick to think that I subjected these people to that. I mean, it was really awful. Of course, I had no idea. But that was a time where I felt, if anything, they would probably really hesitate to go forth, but they didn't. They understood. I mean, they were as horrified as I was, but they also really understood.
Thank you for sharing that, and I'm sorry that that happened. Merle, I wanted to ask you, I mean, you must have heard some significant stories and journeys of these survivors. Were there key sort of threads or life lessons that you got out of these, that impacted you?
Absolutely. Probably the greatest impact was hearing, watching them, seeing who they were, and understanding the resilience of the human spirit. And just an example of that was when I was probably around 50, I went to a luncheon. And so the survivors were, this was for survivors who were probably in their 70s at the time. And I was thinking it was probably going to be, we're just going to sit around and have lunch, talk, and that was fine. But I was not really that excited about going to the luncheon. And then the band started playing, and every single survivor got up and danced. It was like I was in a room filled with teenagers. And I said to myself, okay, this is the lesson. Another time, I remember at one of the student awareness days, something had happened and I was really struggling. And one of the survivors came up to me in the morning and said, "You don't look so good. Are you okay?" And I said, "I'm just having a really tough time. Something's going on." And he sat down, he put his hand on my hand, and he said, "Look, nothing stays the same forever. This too shall pass. You will get through this." And I looked at him and I thought, here he is, this amazing person who has been through some of the worst experiences humanly possible. And he's giving me this advice. Another time, I was 45 at the time, and I was at my desk when I learned that my closest friend died. I had gotten the call. I was actually going to visit her in Atlanta 2 days later because she was suffering from cancer, and she died. And I went outside and I sat on a bench, and I actually was journaling, and I was crying. And one of the survivors came out and sat next to me, and she put her arm around me, and I said, I feel really funny crying when you lost 150 family members. And she said to me, "Merle, you can never compare tragedies. And this is your loss. And so it's okay. It's okay." So that was also another thing that I really learned. After that, went on a survey. I did my own private survey because I was just curious to know how it was that the survivors were able to pick up the pieces after losing so many family members. So I would just ask survivors, how did you deal with the loss? Across the board, the survivors said to me, "I was too hungry All I cared about was food. I didn't have time to mourn. And so it wasn't until after the Holocaust that caught up with them, because I think we all know if you don't mourn today, it's going to catch up with you. You're going to, at some point, you have to deal with the loss. And so for me, that was a huge, really a huge, important lesson. The one thing that I found that almost all survivors felt was that they survived because of luck. Whatever the luck was, whether it was that they were in line at a concentration camp getting some of their soup, and the person who was passing it out was someone from their hometown and put a potato peel in and gave them just that extra nourishment to get them through another day. I mean, there were all kinds of stories about the luck that they had, but every single survivor in his or her story mentioned luck.
Well, they sound like some completely unthinkable situations, and it's amazing to hear from you the powerful and uplifting life lessons that have come out of them. It's remarkable. I wanted to circle back a little bit, and just also you had mentioned that some of these stories were so incredibly difficult to hear and listen to, and I wanted to ask you, how did you navigate sort of the emotional toll that some of those stories took on you?
Probably the best thing I did for myself was I came home and journaled. And being able to write down what I learned and how I felt was so important to me. It really made a huge difference. And then fast forward, I have used those stories in one of my books, because not all of them, of course, but I chose stories to share because for me, the biggest thing was the promise that I made to the survivors that I would tell their stories. And so that was really a huge piece of all of this. And I listened really carefully to what they said and made sure to put down on paper as much as I could so that I would remember. How I dealt emotionally, there were times, Gaia, that I actually felt that I had become hardened. It scared me a little bit. I would listen to these stories and not be horrified. And that was upsetting to me. But I think it was just that there were so many. I mean, I worked with so many survivors and heard so much. And I think one just builds up some kind of protection, maybe. It doesn't mean that I didn't feel it, but I did not absorb it in a way that was so painful that I couldn't live with it. And I have heard some pretty horrible stories. Horrible stories.
Well, speaking of stories, how do you believe that the transmission of these stories has helped in the healing process, all the way along the line for both survivors and their families? And then, these stories are then transmitted to students along the way. I just wanted to hear how you feel that the stories have impacted sort of the whole healing process along the way.
For the survivors, I think telling their story, for those who can, and I know there are a lot of survivors who have never shared their stories, but for those survivors who have shared their stories, I think it's made a huge difference in their healing, and they feel that they are helping someone else learn something. So for them, that's really important. I recently was asked to do a workshop on Holocaust survivors, second generation, and intergenerational trauma. And so I interviewed 10 second generation, which means children of survivors. And the stories I heard from them were stories of trauma, real trauma, because if their parents talked to them, then the stories they heard were really traumatic. If they didn't talk to them, the parents were holding those stories. So there was always this underlying current of loss and pain and sorrow. And so the second generation really, I think in some cases, really suffered. Many of them said that their parents lost so many people that they put all of their hopes and dreams and desires into them. So the expectations for them were tremendously unrealistic. And that was really a problem. So it's those kinds of things that the survivors and second generation really struggled. Survivors often would say to me, I can tell my grandchildren the stories that I've never told my children. And they've said, it's easier for us to do this. Somehow putting the pain on our children is too great. So the third generation, I think, has benefited much more than the second generation in terms of the students hearing the stories. I cannot imagine any student who has talked to a Holocaust survivor who will ever think about the Holocaust in a different way, except some kind of understanding of what man did to man. And so I think that has made a big difference. The teachers in the teacher institutes, they told us that their lives changed as a result, and they were hell-bent on going back and sharing with every single student. One of the liberators, so a liberator was someone who came in, in the army and liberated the concentration camps. And one of the liberators became a teacher. And he said he had never spoken to anyone about the Holocaust for years and years. And most liberators had not, in fact. And he said that one day he was a history teacher, he was teaching history, and one of the kids said something about not believing in the Holocaust. And he went home and he got the pictures that he had hidden in his attic, and he brought them to show the kids. And he said that was when he began talking. The majority of liberators said that until Holocaust denial, they never shared with their families what they experienced. But once people started denying the Holocaust, they felt responsible for telling the world what happened. And, I think that that's pretty profound, and I think it's really important. Also, when a liberator would speak, almost always, these men would cry. When a Holocaust survivor spoke, practically the only time they ever cried was when they would say, the last time I saw my mother or my father, my brother or sister. You could tell in their voice they were shaking. But for the liberators, very often they would really break down. So it's always been my theory, and I totally have no idea whether I'm right or wrong, but they were 18, 19, 20-year-old kids and had absolutely no idea what had gone on beyond those gates when they broke the gates open and started seeing these skeleton-like people coming toward them.
Thank you for sharing that, Merle. And, I wanted to ask you, because I feel like there's such a disconnect between, what happened, for example, receiving an extra piece of potato skin in your soup and that being so important, to sort of today's reality. And I wanted to ask, what was your experience as an observer of the younger students that were listening or participating and hearing these stories for the first time? What was the experience like for them that you observed?
Probably was very hard for them to comprehend. The very youngest students. So we never sent a survivor to a grade below fourth grade. And I actually think even fourth grade was too young. But for the younger fourth, fifth, sixth graders, we would send child survivors. So those were children who were hidden, who were taken from their families and lived, in different homes or lived in monasteries or convents. Their stories, they could relate a little bit because the survivors would talk about being young children and what it was like. One of the things that I found was that the students mostly wanted to hear about the concentration camp experiences. I don't know whether it's just a fascination with the worst crimes. I never really understood it, but it was like the more guts and gore you can share with us to bring it on. I mean, it might sound crazy, but we always at our programs always had a camp survivor, a concentration camp survivor, be the one to stand up and speak to the entire audience before they talk to the survivors at their tables, because that is a curiosity. Like I said, some of the kids cried. Some of them were in total awe. At the end of the day at these programs, you would see these big, tall kids hugging these short little women, men, saying, "You're my hero." So, it was really an amazing experience to watch. And then at the end of the programs, we would open the mic up and let students get up and talk about what they experienced. And we couldn't have paid them to say the things that we hope they would say about how they will be different and how they will go home and tell their family and how they will never forget.
It must have been an incredibly rewarding and moving experience for you to be the creator and the observer of these events. Absolutely incredible. Merle, I wanted to ask you on a personal note. So you have written two books about journaling, and you very much about the importance of leaving a legacy, and you teach courses around that, and you encourage people today to document and leave their experiences. And I wanted to ask, how was your time, at the Documentation and Education Center? How did it influence your particular perspective on the importance of preserving and leaving a history through stories?
I always felt that to be able to pass along these stories was so tremendously important. And I was not at all involved in the documentation department and the interviews, but I certainly watched a lot of them. And I think that it helped me to understand that as we go through life, we all live our lives in a way that we hope we're going to be remembered. We hope that our lives mattered. And working at the Holocaust Center really helped me understand how important it is to get these stories down now, because we have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. And so I think above all else, that was really important. As someone who journals on a daily basis, for me, I just have had the need to do it. It isn't something that I've consciously said, I have to write this down so I will have it forever. I just have to do it. And so I've done it. I don't know if being at the center influenced my desire, but I do know that I am grateful to have had the experience, certainly grateful to have had the privilege of working with these 500 Holocaust survivors.
Thank you. Merle, could you tell us a little bit about your two books?
I'd be happy to. So my two books are actually from excerpts from my journals. So I've been keeping journals since 1974. And at some point, I decided that I wanted to leave something to my children. I thought at one point I would leave my journals, but realized that they were not for anyone but my eyes only. And so I embarked on a project where I went through, actually at the time it was 359 of my journals, and I chose 70 different topics. I then went through the journals, marked the topics, typed them into the computer under the different subjects. And that took me 14 years to do. And then I spent 5 years trying to decide which topics I really wanted to share. I had under each topic anywhere from 75 to 450 pages. So I first whittled down the number of topics. I decided I would have 11 in each of the two books. And then I spent, well, all that process, the second part of it, took 5 years before I could feel as though I was sharing the excerpts that really told the most important stories to me. I wrote the books for my children, but I decided to share them with a broader world because I had two reasons. One, I wanted people to understand the value of journaling. And the second reason was because I want people to look at my life, not because it's my life, but as a mirror into their own lives. So what I'm hoping is that when people will read some of the human elements of my life, that they will relate in some way. And at the end of each of the chapters, I have journal prompts so that even if someone doesn't want to journal, they can read the prompts and think about it so that it brings some of what I've written back to them.
Thank you, Merle. And question, is there a particular message that's on or in your heart around the Holocaust, the survivors, your experience at the Documentation Center, and journaling?
The message in terms of the Holocaust is that we really need to make a point to listen to one another and find a way to have peace in this world so that this never happens again. You know, we say the expression is this should never happen again. And unfortunately, it has happened again and again, not the same scale and maybe not for exactly the same reasons. But I think that the message to me is that if we want a peaceful world, we have to find peace with ourselves, number one, with our families, our neighbors, so that we can go out and make it around the world. In terms of journaling, my message is that it was the greatest gift I ever have given myself. And I can honestly say that I feel I know who I am in a way that I never would before if I didn't journal. So I am so grateful that I have decided to do that. And one of the interviews asked me a question. It was the only question I have not been able to answer. He said to me, "So Merle, what would your life be like if you didn't journal?" And I said, "I can't even imagine. I cannot even imagine."
I cannot even imagine your life without journaling. Merle, I wanted to say thank you for taking us on this journey with you. You continue to absolutely amaze me. The more I get to know you and the more I hear your stories and your life experience, the more amazed I am. And I wanted to also take a moment to acknowledge you for, I feel like in this interview, you touched on something very, very important. And I want to say thank you to you for creating the space and the container for these stories to be transmitted, but also creating in-person events or being instrumental in creating these in-person events where, survivors could meet students of today. And when you mentioned that point of connection where they hugged each other at the end and said, "You my hero," I find that incredible that, you can put people who were complete strangers in a room together, and through creating the space and through them sharing their stories, you create this absolutely profound and beautiful point of connection that is life-changing and, passed down for generations. And so thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Gaia. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of this.
It is my pleasure, and it's always an honor for me. And for those of you who have been watching, if you have enjoyed the content, I encourage you to please like, share, comment. If you have any questions for Merle, please feel free to put them in the comments sections. Also, as mentioned earlier, we did another fascinating interview with Merle around journaling, and we're actually going to be doing a third one shortly, so look out for that one too. We will be putting all the links to Merle's books and her website and how you can contact her, which I encourage you to do. And thank you again to everyone for watching and listening.